Alrighty, hi everyone. Welcome again to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host. And for this episode, I'm interviewing Ron Cooper, author of the book, The Gospel of the Twin. And for those of you following along who are interested, please feel free to go over now to the Amazon link in the description below the video and check out or get a copy of Ron's book. So Ron, welcome to AuthorStory. It's great to have you with us as our guest.
Thank you, Alex. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So, Ron, first off, please introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little about your story and about your book. What's your background?
I was born and raised in the low country of South Carolina, swampy area, spitting distance from the ocean, just up the road from Charleston. I went to the College of Charleston as an undergraduate, where I majored in English, but I found that I got really interested in philosophy while I was there. And by the time I graduated, I needed to make a decision as to whether I was going to go to graduate school and maybe get an MFA, and my first thought was I'd become a poet and go for the money, or go study philosophy for a while. And I ended up going to the University of South Carolina, where I got an MA in philosophy. I thought that might get that out of my system, but it didn't. I was still struggling with the big questions, so I went to Rutgers and got a PhD in philosophy. In the meantime, I met my wife at University of South Carolina. She was getting her MA in English at the time.
Okay.
We got married and ended up moving to Florida in 1988. And since 1995, I have taught philosophy and religion at the College of Central Florida in Ocala, Florida. Now, even though I was living the academic life, doing philosophy, writing books and essays and going to conferences and these things, I knew that I had some novels in the back of my head that I needed to purge one day. And one idea I had for a novel I'd worked on, scribbled on for years and years, and that finally became my first novel, which was published in 2007, called Hume's Fork, which is primarily a humorous novel. There's some philosophy in there. And then I had a second novel come out named Purple Jesus in 2010. But all along, I've been thinking about a topic.
All right, go ahead.
That has fascinated me for many years. I'm very much interested in ancient Jewish history and in early Christian history. And what many people don't know is that early Christianity had many different groups. There wasn't something called the church, as some people mistakenly believe.
Right.
And among those groups were some early Christians who believed that Jesus had a twin brother. And there's actually a book that they believe he wrote. And that seemed to me like a great start for a novel. What would it be like to be Jesus' twin brother?
Oh, okay, cool. All right. So, what inspired you to write this book? I mean, I got that you really are really involved in this as part of your academic work. But what inspired you to write this particular novel?
Well, I think there's a great deal that people, Christians or otherwise, can learn from studying early Christian history, just to find out something about the social history of the Mediterranean world, what kinds of political pressures were people facing then that we might still be facing now, and there are just some good stories there. And I thought that maybe for many people the best access to some of these stories, some of this information is not through reading academic work. Most of it is found in academic work, and that's not for everybody. Novels sometimes work far better, and so I thought that maybe a good way to share some of this information and tell an entertaining story would be to put it in the form of a novel.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, hey, no doubt. I mean, Jesus Christ is a highly influential figure in human history, and I know you've been researching on this academically for quite some time now. But how long really were you interested in Jesus Christ as a historical figure?
What's interesting, Alex, is that I didn't really get interested in Jesus or Christianity until after I sort of left religion. That happened when I was in college. It's what happens to many college students.
Okay.
They begin to have doubts, and they give up some of their maybe childhood beliefs. But that gave me a certain objectivity that I could take another look at the Bible and some of the research done on Jesus, and I found it far fascinating than I ever did as I was trying to understand it from within religion. What I discovered was that I think that many Christians have a kind of watered down version of what Jesus was trying to do.
Okay.
And if they were so inclined, and they read some of the research done by some great biblical historians like John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, and others, they might find some dimensions to their faith that they never knew about before. And that really excited me when I realized that one could look at the historical Jesus, Jesus the man, how he was dealing with Roman occupation in his time and the extraordinary poverty his people were going through,
Right.
and what kind of inner strength he was trying to give people. I think it's a very powerful message there.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so given that this book is a novel, I mean, it is a work of fiction, but I'm sure there are quite a few facts behind it. I mean, to back up the premise and the story itself. How much additional research did you do for this book? I mean, or was it all just like already available over the course of the years of your work on this?
Yeah, most of it is work that I have been doing for many years. I've been doing this research, sometimes formally and sometimes just sort of just because I'm interested, and I'll pick up something by a new book by another biblical historian to get their take on things. So I didn't have to do a great deal of extra research. I mean, of course, I wanted to go back and try to get a few facts straight. The facts that are most important, I think, probably have to do with the social history of what was it like to be a first century Mediterranean Jewish peasant living under Roman occupation.
Right.
And that's an element of Jesus' life that I think most Christians are totally unaware of. Once you understand the political situation and the social predicament that he and his people were in, it really sheds some new light on some of the material you find in the New Testament.
All right. Okay. Cool. Got that. So I mean, I'm sure a lot of people aren't. I mean, even practicing Christians or of any Christian denomination, I'm sure a lot of them are not familiar with the social and political situation of the Jews at the time. Can you just give a short summary of what exactly was going on, the background behind his ministry and all his works?
Yeah, sure. But by the time Jesus was born, his region, he was from the Galilee region, which is right next door to Judea. Judea was where Jerusalem was. That's where the Jewish government, the temple, was located. He grew up sort of in the boonies of Palestine. But by the time he was born, the Romans had occupied the region for about 60 or 70 years.
Right.
Taxation was incredible. If you were an ordinary Jewish peasant, you paid about half of what you earned to taxes.
Wow. Okay.
The Roman army would police the region. If you were a young man, you might find yourself dragged out of town and forced to put on armor and become a Roman soldier. You might be sold into slavery. There was constant fear for anyone living there. One of the reasons why the Jews had things rather difficult was that other people in the Roman Empire who weren't themselves Romans, like Greeks and Syrians and otherwise, they didn't really have a problem following Roman religious demands. You were supposed to make a sacrifice to the emperor and at least tip your hat towards the Roman gods. The Romans let people do kind of what they did as long as they followed certain basic rules.
Right.
Most Jews had a really difficult time with that because they knew that their God was not the gods of the Romans. Mm-hmm. And another element here was a kind of civil unrest, because if you were an ordinary Jew, you would see the Jewish temple leadership, which was really the governing body, as collaborators with the Romans. So it was as if you were fighting two enemies. During Jesus' day, there were roaming bandits who would, almost like tiny groups of guerrilla soldiers, who would do quick attacks on maybe a Roman legion that was marching through. But they also attacked. They attacked the upper class Jews as well. So it was quite a problem, particularly if you were a poor person, because you felt as if you weren't getting any representation.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So what about?
So part of what?
Go ahead. please.
So part of what I find interesting about Jesus is that for most modern day Christians, they think he is talking um, about one's salvation and making sure that you secure a place in heaven after death. I don't think that's what he was after at all. And it's not just my idea. There are many historians that agree. I think he was primarily concerned with helping his fellow Jews think about a way of preserving their heritage without joining up with the militia, without going into hiding into the desert, into the caves, as some people did. How can they live their lives as close to ordinary as possible and not lose their culture in the face of this terrible oppression? How can they remain distinctly Jewish despite the pressures that they were getting from the Romans?
Okay. Well, that's interesting because that certainly puts new light on his ministry, on Jesus' ministry.
Yeah, yes, indeed, it does. I mean, and I don't want to say that he had no spiritual message. He certainly had a spiritual message, but I think that many people miss that political element, and I don't think that he saw those two as distinct. I think he thought about whatever your spiritual fulfillment, development is tied up with who you are and how you are connected with your people.
Okay, interesting. So Ron, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the man. What really are the facts about the historical Jesus of Nazareth? Who was this guy? I mean, factually speaking.
That's a really tough question because just about everything we have to go on comes from the Bible. And the New Testament Gospels were written by people who, they weren't historians. They had a certain message they wanted to give.
Right.
They wrote these things decades after Jesus was born. There are many things that you find in the Gospels that seem to have been written by people who did not understand Jewish culture at all. So at least a couple of the Gospel writers were certainly outsiders. They had absorbed some of the stories about Jesus and some of his teachings in their own way, and were giving it back to us in a different way. When we look for extra biblical references to Jesus, they're very few. There's one or two from a Jewish historian named Josephus. There are one or two decades later by some Roman officials who just say something like, "Who are these people called these Christians? What are they up to? Are they troublemakers or not?"
Right.
So what we have to do is sift through the New Testament and see what best makes sense. These seem to be the bare facts. He was born somewhere around the turn of the millennia. He was born into poverty, probably, although this will sound strange to many people, probably not in Bethlehem, probably in Nazareth. There are reasons why the two birth stories in the New Testament put him in Bethlehem. There are very different sorts of reasons, but probably in Nazareth. He may have, since Nazareth was close to a Roman city that was being built as he was a boy called Sepphoris, about an hour or so walk away. He probably went with his father Joseph to Sepphoris every day to do construction work.
Okay.
The Greek term in the New Testament that tells us what Joseph did was tekton, which actually means something like unskilled laborer. That's often translated as carpenter. He may have did a little carpentry, probably did more masonry than anything else. That's an important fact because if Jesus was going to Sepphoris as a little boy, we know that from archaeology that Sepphoris had quite a mixture of ethnicities going there. We find things written in Greek, things written in Latin,
right,
all sorts of stuff. So he may have had a little more cosmopolitan boyhood than you might ordinarily expect from a tiny village in the backwaters of the Galilee.
Right.
It appears that he was almost surely executed by Pontius Pilate. We know Pontius Pilate was a real Roman governor of the region from the year 26 to the year 36.
Right.
What most historians think was that for about 20 years after Jesus' death, there was a very small movement going on in Jerusalem by some of his close associates, but things didn't really pick up speed and spread out to other cultures until Paul came along in the middle of the first century. Now that's not a whole lot that we can really know about Jesus.
Right.
And what many historians have done is they've gone through the Gospels with fine-tooth combs and tried to figure out which material is earlier than later, which of the things Jesus maybe really said, which probably was said by later people and kind of got mixed in. And I find all that stuff quite fascinating. I think there might be many Christians who might get a little nervous from that sort of research, but I think they find it fascinating too that they did so.
Okay, interesting, definitely. I mean, we know we're kind of familiar with Jesus in the Bible, and not much really is known about the historical Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
Right. So, Ron, what are the known facts regarding Jesus' ministry?
Here's what seems to be central to his ministry, and it might be a little different from what many Christians think. We've had 2,000 years for Christianity to heap upon itself a number of ways of thinking about his ministry, and some of those ways might be far from what he did. Here's what I think he was up to, and again, it's not just my ideas; it's the idea of a number of biblical commentators. I think one thing that was central to what he was up to was an extreme egalitarianism, meaning that everybody is equal. According to the New Testament, Jesus' followers included the poorest of the poor. The Greek word that was used to describe his family and most of his associates was not the Greek word for poor; it was the word for destitute. These are very poor people. But he also had people in his following that would not ordinarily hang around them. Not only did we have men and women traveling together, that just didn't happen, but there were some people at least who had some means. There's one woman described as Herod's steward's wife, which meant that her husband would have been something like Herod's, probably Herod Antipas, one of the governors there. He was Herod's something like bookkeeper, so he would have had something. Matthew is supposedly a tax collector, which meant that everybody else hated him because the way that the Romans collected taxes was not the traditional way that Jews did it.
Right.
And the Romans used Jews to kind of tell on their fellow Jews. And that's why everybody hated the tax collectors. They saw them as traitors.
Okay.
But Jesus accepted everybody. He invites lepers to follow him. And that's something that every ancient culture rejected. In every ancient culture, you had very rigid lines dividing up people into social groups. And Jesus seemed to reject those. And that's one of the things I think we can find quite admirable about him. He was really concerned with poor people. I think he was very much convinced that if you're poor, you don't know where your meal is coming from, how do you have time to think about your salvation? That's the farthest thing from your mind, probably. How do you have time to know how to serve God? That, again, probably the farthest thing from your mind. I really think he believed that first you fill people's bellies and then you fill their souls. He was not a militant. He was I'm quite sure he was opposed to any kind of violence. I mean, he otherwise would have joined one of those militia groups that were running around.
Right.
His message was really more internal than external. What are the external things we can do? That's a different kind of question. How can you find some kind of inspiration and live a life of pride despite what's going on? I think that's what he was really trying to do. I'm not completely sure if he had a plan worked out. I think he had the basics, and he could have been, this sounds a little flippant, making it up as it goes along, but he was doing something different from the others around him.
Okay, cool, got that. Okay, so Ron, what are the known facts regarding Jesus' family? And I mean, I ask because the protagonist for your novel is Jesus' twin. Could he have had a twin? What is his family like?
Well, the New Testament tells us that he had brothers and sisters. In fact, the New Testament names 4 brothers, doesn't name the sisters. We assume that his whole family were Nazarenes in one of the biblical birth stories, because there are only 2 birth stories in the New Testament, and they're quite different. One of them has them leave Nazareth, go to Bethlehem because of taxation. This is from the book of Luke. Very strange story about people being taxed. They got to go to their ancestral homes. It's very odd. The other one has them living in a house in Bethlehem. That's from Matthew. And then they end up going back they end up going to Nazareth because later on they're afraid that King Herod's son might still be trying to kill the baby Jesus.
Right.
But we don't know much more than that. We the book that is called the Gospel of Thomas that came out. It was written probably in the early second century. It may have been the late first century, the same time as the New Testament Gospels were written. That book claims to be written by one Judas Didymus Thomas. Now that's significant because Didymus is the Greek word. It was written in Greek originally. The Didymus is the Greek word for twin.
Okay.
Thomas is the Aramaic word. Aramaic is the language Jesus and his fellow Jews spoke at the time.
Right.
Thomas is the Aramaic word for twin, and Judas is the name of one of his brothers in the New Testament. So of course that gave some early Christians that kind of made a little light bulb go off in their head. What is this guy saying? I am Jesus' twin brother. Mm-hmm. Wow, if he has a twin brother, surely he knew all the secrets.
Okay.
And that book called the Gospel of Thomas, which wasn't available to us until the 20th century. We had little snippets from it, and early Christian writers mentioned it, but it got dug up in Egypt in the early 20th century. And it does have that sort of a flavor of secrecy going on in there. There's one remarkable moment in which Thomas says that Jesus pulled him aside and told him three things, and then later it doesn't tell us what they are. And then later the other disciples asked, "What did Jesus tell you?" Uh-huh. And Thomas said, "Well, if I told you even one of those things, you would cry out to heaven that fire come down and consume you." So you get the idea that according to this book, it's not the only book like that. There are plenty of early Christian writings that didn't make it into the Bible, and they have some very weird things to say. Uh-huh. But many of them, like this Gospel of Thomas, seem to say that Jesus had secret teachings that are not meant for everybody.
Okay.
So of course, everybody wants to hear what those are.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely that definitely adds to the curiosity of this Jesus and his messages. Sure,
and like I said, some of those early writings that didn't make it into the Bible are so very different from biblical material that it shows us, the important historical thing is it shows us how different Christian communities could be. But sometimes you wonder, how could they get this idea? This is so weird.
Right. Okay, cool. Got that. Okay, so Ron, let's get a little bit in the book. I mean, what made you decide to write it from the point of view of Jesus' twin? I mean, you just mentioned that Jesus had brothers, and you could have written it from one of their points of view.
Right, and actually the other brothers make appearances in the book, particularly the one, particularly James, who gets a great deal of attention by biblical scholars. There's a book in the New Testament that people believe was written by Jesus' brother James, and we know that Jesus' brother James, at least appears to have been a leader of this small Jesus movement just after Jesus' death in Jerusalem. But from my point of view, and I think most people would agree, is that if Jesus had a twin brother, then if anybody understood what Jesus was really up to, surely it would be his identical twin brother. And throughout the novel, Thomas struggles with that. Thomas knows that he was closer to Jesus than anyone in the world. He loves Jesus more than anybody in the world. But even though he's his identical twin, and Jesus did confide in him, Thomas has spent his life trying to kind of unravel the riddle that Jesus was. He says repeatedly that he's an old man now. He's in his 80s. He's been in self-imposed exile for many years, and he's finally returned back to Palestine. And he finds that people have been saying many things about Jesus, all of which he thinks are false.
Right.
And he feels compelled to write what he thinks is the true story. And he says at the very beginning, I understand Jesus, I'm going to tell the world. But as he tells the story, he realizes that maybe he doesn't quite totally understand Jesus. Maybe there's still something of an enigma left. And so much of the book is Thomas kind of struggling with how is he finally going to label his brother, and is he ever going to get over the guilt that he feels that his brother died young.
Right. Okay. Well, that's definitely a good story right there. Okay, interesting. Okay. So Ron, authors who write nonfiction as well as fiction books, they sometimes go on a journey as they do so. Has working on this book done that for you in any aspect of your life or in your knowledge?
Sure. My first two novels were set in my childhood home in South Carolina, so it was so that was a certain kind of journey. It was a good.
Right.
It takes some work to kind of avoid any nostalgia that you want to put in there, and try to make the story actually as accurate as you can, and not look at it through your kid's eyes or
Right.
through your adult eyes. So this is my first one. The Gospel of the Twin is my first one that is a historical novel, which takes place 2,000 years ago and then halfway around the world.
Right. Right.
So that's a challenge. It can be fun at times and certainly frustrating at times to try to think like, what does one, how does one see the world as I said earlier, first century Mediterranean Jewish peasant?
Right.
What kind of are on your mind all the time? You're thinking, the old saying that to a carpenter everything looks like a hammer or a nail.
Right.
And so if that's how you grow up, what does everything appear to you like? Everything appears to you perhaps as an authority above you, the Romans, the temple leadership.
Right.
You're thinking about being hungry all the time. You're thinking probably all the time is there any way that I can escape this horrible life?
Mm-hmm.
I know nothing but kind of unskilled labor. I've lived in this tiny village all my life, and everybody else has the same. Maybe they all have a kind of defeatist attitude. Maybe some of them are more optimistic than others. I mean, it's a mindset that those of us who've grown up in the United States, where we have relative luxury compared to most places in the world, aren't used to.
Right. Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay, got that. So, Ron, are there any other? Is there anything else, like other stories or topics that you may want to explore as an author in the future?
Well, actually, I've been writing my fourth novel, which is
Oh.
somewhat akin to my first two, although this fourth one is my first one set in Florida. I've lived in Florida long enough now that I have to think of it as home. so,
Okay. Okay. Cool.
and
Cool.
so I wrote one set here, right in north central Florida, where I live, and
Right.
that was a nice little journey because I had to do a good bit of historical work to understand the region and to understand the politics. And the main character is in the sheriff's department, so I interviewed some people in the sheriff's department to see what their daily lives are like, and so that was really quite fun. When you learn about the way that other people what they do day to day in a job that just you've never experienced.
Right.
It can be quite eye opening, and so I hope that in this new novel I've represented them well.
Okay. All right. Cool. I got that. All right. So, Ron, in the last few minutes of this interview, are there like any last words of wisdom you'd like to share to inspire listeners? It may be about Jesus, or it may be about something else. Your call.
That's quite a charge. Wisdom. See, I hope that if someone enjoys this book, and it is, I'm glad you emphasized it is a work of fiction. It's a work of imagination. I hope it to be primarily an entertaining story. There's humor in there too, believe it or not. I haven't sounded very funny here. It sounds all pretty serious stuff, poverty and oppression.
Right.
But there's humor in there as well. I hope that if someone is a Christian who reads this, they might think, there's more going on to early Christianity than I thought,
Hmm.
and perhaps I should find out more. And if that person is not a Christian, they might think, there's a lot more going on with Christianity. I need not believe that Jesus was divine. I need not believe in miracles to find his story quite inspirational.
Right. Okay. Cool. Fantastic. Okay, so in closing then, the book is The Gospel of the Twin. The author is our guest, Ron Cooper. And you can check out his book at his website, roncooper.org, and also on Bancroft Press, the Bancroft Press website. So Ron, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being an author story. It was a very interesting session for me, and I'm sure it'll give our listeners some intriguing thoughts and information on the life of one of the most influential people in world history.
Thank you, Alex. It's been quite a pleasure.
Cool. And if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, just click the subscribe button. If you'd like, go ahead and buy the book right now by going to the Amazon link below. So that's all, folks. So long for now, everyone. But I'll be back on Author Story with another inspiring author.